And hey, there's Tom Jordan, and it is Friday. And in just a bit, I'm planning to read some of your comments that you've been submitting throughout the week here on our first week here of Tom Jordan Live. And yes, I do read them, as does the staff here. And I really appreciate them, even the not so nice ones. It's all cool. And we will get to those after my interview coming up with Senator Jim Runestad. Right now, though, before we get to that, I'm going to talk about something a lot of people nowadays do not want us to talk about, even though we used to talk about it pretty frequently in this free society. Instances of voter fraud. We know they've been documented throughout U.S. history, including multiple elections in times past, elections being overturned, in fact, because of these fraudulent ballots that have been occurred and the people have been caught. Sometimes they're not caught. A lot of times they're not. And Democrats used to be the ones, big proponents of calling out and preventing these types of fraud. They did so big time in 2016. Remember that? The election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the whole thing, in their view, was a fraudulent and stolen election. But the narrative nowadays is there is no election fraud that occurs, certainly not enough to overturn an election. And I had a company executive at a media network tell me that the topic of voter fraud is off limits to talk show hosts because all of those cases were adjudicated. And that somehow we know that those fraud claims have been debunked in the courts. No, they haven't. Actually, most of those cases were not allowed to even proceed without even considering the evidence from these judges. They didn't look at the evidence. They tossed the whole thing out. So now there are laws in place that actually exacerbate the issue, in which we'll talk about that in a moment in one of the big states that is occurring in. But clearly strengthening election laws such as requiring photo identification and proof of U.S. citizenship, that's kind of a big deal. And it's essential to protecting the integrity of the democratic process and ensuring that every legitimate vote counts, and then weeding out the votes that are not legitimate. And it seems to me like a no-brainer, but more and more, these things are being thrust aside in order to be more inclusive. One of the claims from the left is that somehow, for example, minorities in the black community are being disenfranchised because they are required to have an identification. By the way, who says that? Who's saying that blacks are being disenfranchised because they have to have an ID like everybody else? Well, it's mostly white people who are saying that, most of these progressive leftists. Most black people support ID laws. Did you know that? It's like 78% support, and that's more than what white people support. Which is close. It's about 77%. The vast majority of Americans say, yeah, it makes total common sense to prove who you are by having a photo ID, and at the very least, verifying the signatures, which more and more they're not doing in several states. So requiring all voters to present photo identification when voting, all that does is ensure that only eligible voters are casting their ballots, and it's, safeguarding against identity theft, identity fraud. Requiring photo ID, it not only secures elections from fraud, but I think also restores faith in the electoral process. It's not the claims of fraud that get rid of faith in the election or a threat to democracy. It's the fraud itself that does that. So opponents claim, opponents of voter ID and these things, that it burdens the voters. But if that's the case, if that was even true, the solution is pretty simple. Provide them free identifications for those who need them. Just give them an ID. Requiring proof of U.S. citizenship. What about that? When registering to vote, voting is a right reserved for citizens, and ensuring that only citizens register to vote is vital. So there are proposals out there that demand tangible proof of citizenship, which can prevent the ongoing issue of these non-citizens voting. That is happening, by the way, in this country. They're finding more and more non-U.S. citizens who are voting in our elections. Maybe it's intentional, maybe it's accidental, but with proof of citizenship, the election officials can confidently maintain an accurate voter roll. There's not a whole lot of accurate voter rolls now in this country. They got to clean those up. And some may argue that, the measures are too restrictive by putting these requirements in place, but it's a basic responsibility to confirm citizenship for the right to vote. Those are just a couple of ways to secure elections pretty easily and pretty fairly without really too much controversy. But it's become controversial because of political reasons. And yet laws are being implemented to make it easier to commit fraud. And you take Michigan, for example. Again, one of these leading progressive states in the country, Michigan Senate. They just passed a slate of integrity killing bills this week. It's called State Voting Rights Act. They claim it protects voting in the state, but it actually likely makes it easier to have fraudulent votes be part of the elections. So the Democrat-controlled House in Michigan, they're set to now receive those passed bills in the Senate. It's 401 through 404, SB 401 through 404, and it shifts the oversight of all the elections from the local officials to the far more progressive officials in the state government that currently exist right now in that state. And the shift represents this. It's a pretty profound overreach, in a lot of people's mind, by the state government by moving control of elections from elected local officials to court-appointed monitors and the executive branch. And by the way, it's happening under a lot of intimidation and threats that if the local clerks and the local canvassers don't certify the elections ministerially, like they just have to do it regardless, that the Secretary of State and the Attorney General are going to come after them. Their job as canvassers in these states is to make sure that the votes are accurate and they match, the voter rolls, and they often don't. And when they don't, what they're supposed to do is provide some type of investigation into why that is occurring. Before we can certify this, it seems something is amiss here. And so we need to make sure that these are incredibly accurate. That now is being threatened. That investigates, well, actually, it's now becoming illegal in the state of Michigan and others as well, against state law to even think about doing another vote or recount. If there are accusations of fraud are not enough for a recount now in the state of Michigan. By the way, there's something called ranked choice voting, which is seen pretty much as an affront to the whole idea of one person, one vote. And it makes elections a lot harder to audit. That was another thing, ranked choice voting, that was put into these recently passed this week election bills in the Senate in Michigan. Senator Jim Runestad, he warned that this package of bills sets a dangerous precedent of executive overreach and undermines the balance of power that keeps governments accountable. And allowing the Secretary of State to unilaterally change election procedures without input from the legislature, which, by the way, the legislature is the one who is supposed to set the election procedures and election laws. The Secretary of State now just does it on her own based on what she feels would be better regardless of the laws that are in place. Jim Runestad says it's a dangerous precedent. It tips the scales towards authoritarian control rather than empowering voters and local officials. Jim Runestad is a Michigan state senator who opposes those bills, and I caught up with the senator as he was on a fact-finding trip to the U.S.-Mexico border in McAllen, Texas. Here's that conversation. All right, Senator Jim Runestad, he's been one of the vocal objectors to, of course, all these laws that are now trying to be passed through the Michigan legislature that deal with the election integrity issues. Jim Runestad, state senator out of Michigan's 23rd District. Senator, it's really nice to have you back with me, but on this new program. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Tom. I'm so excited about your new show. When you were on the other stations, you were always the one person the voice I wanted to hear because I knew I was going to get good content and not filtered and censored content. So I'm glad to be on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're totally opposed to censorship here. So this is totally uncensored, and we want people to hear the truth about what's happening. So that's why I loved having you on back then, and I'm really grateful that you're here with us again here on Tom Jordan Live. I know you're in McAllen, Texas right now at this time that we're doing this, and you're down there to talk about illegal immigration, I'm sure, issues with the border crisis that we've seen become exponentially worse over the past 3.5 years. What are you learning down there before we get to these election integrity issues in the state of Michigan? What are you learning about the border and illegal immigration down in McAllen, Texas?
Well, we're just getting started, and it is horrifying beyond belief. What the American people are talking about being censored, everything is being censored from the American people down here. Over 50% of these millions and millions of people coming here are not women and children fleeing oppression. Well over 50% of them are all fighting age males. You see a video of thousands and thousands all over the place, almost all fighting age males. When there are women and children that come across, a lot of times they're coming through what's called the Darien Gap that separates North and South America. It's the most dangerous place in the entire world. And the NGOs, the non-governmental associations, Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish social services, are the ones funding everything. And what they do, and they showed us all this, they give them rape kits for all the women. And in the rape kits, you got the morning after pill, you've got pregnancy prevention, you've got condoms, you have all of this stuff when you're raped, because almost every woman going through there, if they're attractive at all or young at all, are going to get raped. And the NGOs are funding this. They're flying people in from all over the world. It's unbelievable. Almost every nation now has cartel operations, criminal elements in those countries coordinating with the cartels to get people here. And we just saw filming this operation of high priority individuals. They pay 100, 150,000 or more to get in. These are like your terrorists from the Middle East that the United States would be gravely concerned about. But because they're paying so much money, we're showing how they're giving this hidden cameras. They're showing how they're getting Cadillac services if you're a high-profile terrorist coming into the United States, and then they get handed off in the United States sometimes to government officials. The corruption in Mexico, almost everyone is corrupt on the government side because the cartels will either pay you or kill you. Which do you want? And so, I mean, what is your choice? And this is flooding over into the United States with a lot of these corrupt politicians, and the people have no idea the horror of what's going on, and the people these the worst elements from the whole world are being brought here from the criminal elements from 180 countries, coordinating, colluding. We saw how China has just, we're seeing thousands of these all Chinese coming in. And they either come in approved by the government because they want to come in and ensconce them in all different things, or they're unapproved Chinese that had the money to pay their own way. But none of this is being shown by maybe a little bit on Fox News. Other than that, nothing is being shown. So the American people have no idea. It's absolutely terrifying.
Well, so this is amazing to me because we watch. You mentioned the media; they don't cover this, and they don't cover it. And when you bring it up, they act like this is all fabricated. This is all political talking points and partisanship happening and hate speech and whatnot. But in the meantime, you got all these, NBC and ABC and all these CBS and all the other outlets focusing on this whole like Haitian immigrant issue in Ohio, Springfield, Ohio, in terms of, oh, the accusations are hateful accusations that Haitians are eating animals and pets of these citizens. When you just outline what truly is happening with illegal immigration in this country, and I want you to tell, I want you to repeat something because you just said something that just startled me, and we don't hear this enough, that if you're a woman coming across the border, it is a given that you are going to be raped. Like that is what is going to happen to you, especially if you're a young, woman, and there's all these, fighting aged, military aged men coming across. You're going to be raped. So you're saying these NGOs come through, and I saw this 3 years ago when I was working at the time for Real America's Voice out of Denver. But we would send our reporters, even prior to Fox News, down to like right on the border of Guatemala and like Tapachula, Mexico, where they were coming across like 10,000 people in these caravans coming. It was completely being ignored. But what was happening then is still happening now. The rapes are occurring, and the NGOs are funding the ability not only for these people to come across the border and giving them specific instructions on how to come across and sneak across and what to say if you're caught and those type of things, but they're also giving them abortion pills and the ability to get rid of a baby because you've been raped and you want to make sure that baby is gotten rid of. This is stunning to me that these NGOs, and you mentioned a lot of these are these Catholic charities, Lutheran charities, Jewish charities funding these things that, in my view, I would think would be like antithetical to their religion, their religious practices in the first place. But this is happening on a
But
wide scale.
it's billions of dollars. These NGOs are complicit in flying people in from all over the world. In Haiti, in Haiti, I was reading. It's one of the most highly scored country for danger in the world, and the U.S. government tells people if you're there, get out. Don't go to. No one should go to Haiti. It's a failed state. One of the biggest leaders there, his name is Barbecue, and he barbecues human beings and eats them. I mean, they say that the minute that somebody comes from a culture like that, they're going to instantly be Thomas Jeffersons, and they're going to infuse American values because they cross the border. I mean, it's so asinine what the media is trying to portray. No, when these people come here from a failed country like that, where it's just criminality absolutely everywhere, and that they're going to come over here when everything is corrupt, completely corrupt in Haiti. There's the values are just obliterated, but they're going to come across the border, and then the stuff they did in their country, they just would never do that again. It's so asinine. Or that these countries that want to get rid of your criminal element, when the border patrol said, I was just listening today, that they want to work with the cartels and they want to get information from the cartels, they go through the Catholic Social Services. They have
Hmm,
all the connections.
hmm.
They're working with the worst criminal elements. They were saying now in virtually every major city, these Venezuelan cartels, all of these cartels have operations. They were talking about these massive, multi-million-dollar homes with the glass so you can't see in the windows, and on both sides of the border are cartel members. They're making billions and billions and billions of dollars eviscerating the United States. They're estimating at least 15 million people pouring in. These people, we have no idea. It was interesting too. They said at the border, all of their identifications are dropped. If they have money in a
Hmm.
foreign currency, they drop it. If they have prayer books, they drop it. Anything conceivable that would identify them, they're told by the NGOs, get rid of it. Because if you come across, then they're going to have to accept whatever name you give them. And there's no other information. So you could be the worst psychotic, child murdering, raping slime ball of the world, and maybe you're coming back for your third time because you've been convicted and you're coming back again. And they say, just give them any old name you want.
Yeah, it's
This
so
is
sad
this
because
is
you have these major trusted figures in the news business, and I bring up Lester Holt now because he's one of them, but he's considered the most trusted newsman in America. But he came out and he condemned Donald Trump and JD Vance's statements against these like Haitian illegal immigrants, saying that it was hateful and it was leading to all these bomb threats against them. When in fact those are overseas threats, had nothing to do with
yeah.
Donald Trump or JD Vance. But it's just all a distraction to keep us away from what's really happening across the border. Do you believe? So you mentioned they get rid of all their IDs. We can't identify who these people are, and we know there's probably, at the very least, there's 10 million additional illegal immigrants who have come across the border in the past 3.5 years. I think it was the total estimate. I think it was more than this, but the estimated total back in 2020 was that there were 10 million illegal immigrants in this country. Well, now it's at least 20 million. It might be 25. It could be 30, maybe even beyond that, because we really don't know who these people are. And now they're
Those
streaming
numbers,
in
by
through
the
all
way,
over the world.
yeah, those numbers, by the way, are a joke. I read from the Pew Hispanic Trust 35, 40 years ago. At that time, there was 11 million.
Yes.
And every year since, as we're taking in approximately a million a year for 40 years,
Yeah.
they cite the Pew Hispanic Trust from 40 years ago, there's still 11 million. Now, how do you still have 11 million when you're having a million approximately a year for 40 years? There's probably 50 million before the 10 million came in. They just lie and lie and lie. The media is good at one thing. They are excellent at lying. They're a bunch of liars. I was just reading a statistic the other day of how many are Republican journalists. It's around 7%. The
Hmm.
vast majority are all in for the Democrat Party. They're a propaganda arm of the Democrat Party. You can't believe one word most of these so-called journalists said. They're all in for their agenda,
Yeah,
not the truth, their
right.
agenda.
No, you're right, and I've worked in many different newsrooms, and that's just or that ratio is probably absolutely correct, probably accurate in every newsroom I've worked in is like about 90. I would say it was even more than I always saw maybe like 97% Democrat and 3% Republicans. But, it's give or take a few percentage points here and there, but the vast majority. And that's their ideology. So you can understand. We've talked about this a lot this week about how you can't trust what you hear on and read and see now within the various media publications. But this is one very stark example about what's happening to our country. One final question regarding the border, because my understanding is that there's probably 150 nations now that are sending people illegally across, places like, El Paso, Texas. They come across from Ciudad Juarez, or maybe in Yuma, Arizona area. And then there's San Ysidro, California, and Jacamba, and the San Diego border sector there is a big spot as well. So you got millions pouring across. Do you think it's just too late in terms of turning this thing around? I know Donald Trump wants to come in and deport them, and he's being lambasted by the media for daring to say such a thing. But if there are that many dangerous people in this country that don't want to really assimilate into the way that the United States works and our culture whatsoever, and I've talked with many of these immigrants coming over. They some of them do. Some of them are wonderful people. Others really want to do us harm. And they've admitted this is back in like 2008. They were telling me these things down like near San Ysidro in California. Do you think it's too late, or if the right person gets into office, is it possible to deport this many people who might be a danger to our civilization here in the United States?
We were just talking about that, and um, if they're from Mexico, currently, and even going forward, it's way easier to deport them. There are agreements with Mexico. We do have a relationship with Mexico. The whole rest of the world, no. They were saying how the Senegalese cartel that operates between the port between England and France is one of the major operations in England or in Europe, and they're sending people. But there's all these cartels all over the world now are all interlocking in a global operation to get the worst people here. Because if you're like Trump was right, you're a banana republic. You got these jails full of people, criminals that you're paying for. Are you the stupidest banana republic president to not say get them out of here, put them on boats, fly them, get them the hell out of here, send them to America? Then we aren't paying the price for it. We don't have that criminal element. We're not paying for them. And all the media said, dude, there's no proof. There's no proof. How are you going to prove when they have millions and millions of people coming over that no one knows anything about? They went through all the Venezuelan gangs. They said the worst one of all is not the ones that are public. The worst one of all is run by Maduro, that is getting ensconced in here. These people who are to destroy the nation at the right moment. These are not a high profile. These are the lowest profile cartel there is, because they're working to ensconce for the right moment. And the media would say, "Where's your proof? Do you think Maduro is going to go? Yeah, let me show you the books. Let me show you how many how many criminals were. Let's open the book. I mean, they're so stupid. I mean, you just look at the numbers and you can see well, how many people are coming here. All the groups I'm talking to down here that are actually talking to people on the ground, and the media and the whole rest of the world, it's all lies. But I found that out because I was at the golf course and I talked to my buddies in the media, and they all said it's all lies. So it's
Yeah.
all. Are they ever going to come down here and talk to these people? No.
No, no.
Most of the media is just the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party, which they were saying the majority of the Democrats support this. Well, we
Yeah.
should put all these people in their homes. You pay for it. I don't want to pay for it.
I thought of that when David Muir in that debate when he was, combating Trump on this whole issue and said, "Listen, we put a call into the city manager and he said it's not happening. What you said." And Trump's like, "Well, and JD Vance, he's spoken directly to the people on the ground to say these things are occurring. And it's not just this, but this is where the media likes to focus on the pets that are allegedly being eaten. But there's so many other things that are happening to these people in the small population of that town in Ohio, but it's all over the country. And it's not just the silent, more dangerous element that's coming across to ensconce on this country when the time is right. They're still ignoring the major, there's these Venezuelans gangs that are taking over apartment complexes in Colorado and in California and elsewhere. That's not being covered to the degree it should either. So I want to get to this other area of deceit, and which is not properly being covered. And in fact, the media at large kind of wants to push away from this because nowadays it seems to be, almost dangerous rhetoric to claim that there is any potential flaws within our election system right now, or there's any effort right now to make it easier to vote, or maybe easier to cheat. When I said this earlier, that was the claim back in 2016 and 2017 regarding the election that got Donald Trump into office, that it was illegitimate, that the election was stolen, and that there was problems with the voting machines, and that was one of the reasons why Trump got into office. He cheated. All that was okay to say back then, but nowadays you can't say that. And in Michigan, this seems to be one of the states. We have a Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, in the state of Michigan, and now a legislature that has taken over this charge to rewrite the laws regarding election integrity, thanks to a constitutional amendment that was voted in, I think, by deceit. The majority of the voting public in Michigan probably didn't understand fully what was in Proposal 2 and what that would eventually be allowed. That was considered, conspiracy theory. Don't listen to those kooky conservatives who are somehow allegedly mischaracterizing Proposal 2. Can you, before we get into what's happening, 2020, it was a Michigan election was nuts because a lot of things happened in 2020 that Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, allowed to occur temporarily because that was the year of COVID. So she wasn't checking, verifying the signatures as she normally would. And she allowed all this mail in balloting to occur because, well, we had COVID and this was an emergency, but people still need to vote. All these things were allowed. People were getting in the mail these ballot applications who didn't request them and that kind of thing. Well, it seems to me that they liked it so much that in 2022 in the midterms, Senator, they decided to make sure a lot of those things became permanent, and then to expand on those new rules and regulations regarding elections. And the name of it was Proposal 2. Can you describe what that was, how it was characterized, and what it actually now allows for via state constitution?
Yeah, it was an operation that the Democrats have become very adept at, and they have these New York Soros-funded lawyers write these ballot proposals. And in that one, there was just so many things that eviscerate the ability to monitor elections in terms of early voting. And the further you get away from going to the ballot and voting, like in so many countries, actually put their thumb in a purple dye to make sure you can't vote twice. And they have all these things when you're there actually to verify who you are. They got rid of so much of that, and they went into this early voting. They want as much mail-in voting as possible because the chain of custody gets very difficult. They want these ballot boxes again. The chain of custody gets difficult. These are the things that they were working on. But one of the big things in that ballot proposal was that it mandated that you cannot require ID. And the almost hilarious thing, but disgusting thing, is that the operations out of California ran an ad that my wife and I would see probably 15, 18 times a day just when we were watching. And it was this kind of marine looking guy in a rowboat. And he's looking into the camera and he's rowing the boat. And he says, "We've got to get this proposal passed because we've got to protect voter ID." Well, the proposal eliminated voter ID. And here he's saying and they ran this, and it was just a complete utter lie. And I would watch these activists go on all these talking head morons in the media, and they would say, "Well, Mr. Activist, the opponents say that this is actually preventing mandating an ID." And every one of the activists, I saw six or so on different channels, would go the same like they were trained. They'd all go, of
Yes.
course they will say that. Of course you can show ID. Can. Well, you
Yeah.
can show your pet. I mean,
Yeah.
but so not one of those media morons ever said, "Sir, that's not what I asked. If you can, do whatever the hell you want and show your family picture." But what it does is it makes it impossible to require the vote ID. Not
Mm-hmm.
one of these media morons ever asked that question.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, you're
No.
right. They were all lied to.
All right, and that was proposal two, and that was the people coming around and making sure that we were protecting the election. And now that's not the case. And so now the Democratic legislature in your state there, you're a Republican, now the minority party in Michigan. There's something called Senate Bill 603 that has been put up. Democrats have pushed that through. It's just really pretty contentious piece of legislation that seems to like significantly alter the whole process for election recounts, fraud investigations. Like that's not going to be allowed anymore. You can't investigate fraud if there's even some concern that fraud may have occurred. And that's somehow now going to be against state law. And the whole idea is that the allegation of fraud cannot trigger a recount. Is that part of this legislation that's being pushed through? And why would that be the case? Why would that be something that lawmakers thought would be a good idea?
It was pushed through hurriedly through the elections committee with very little notice. Went up on the floor of the Senate. It was a partisan, complete partisan vote. Went over the House, exactly the same operation. This is something that they desperately want for this election. I was telling my colleagues in the Senate, my Republican colleagues, they are not going to accept that this didn't get immediate effect, which means it would be happening this year. It wouldn't go into effect until 3 months after next year. If you don't get immediate effect, that's the rule. So the people are saying, well, we don't need to worry about this, at least this cycle. I said, no, I don't believe that. I was saying this in caucus. I said they may go sine die, which means ending the term, which would make that immediate effect. Um, the week after I said that, the Democrats said unless they get immediate effect on the budget, they're going sine die, which means all these bills would have been when. So I said, do you see, they're still pushing at this. Well, that was too controversial. So now they changed their operation, and what they're proposing to do is to have these rules put in the JCAR committee, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, which is, I think, met only once in almost 2 years. It almost never meets. But they want to push through all the changes that you referenced that are horrible changes. Currently, a board of canvassers, there's 83 of them, and one for every county. They're bipartisan. There's two Republicans, two Democrats. If they find there's evidence or allegations of fraud, they can investigate and they can get subpoena power. Now, keep in mind, it's 2 and 2, so it's going to take one person from one side or the other to say, yeah, I agree, there's an issue here. Then they could go in and they can investigate the fraud. What the Democrats have said is no, you cannot investigate any fraud. You can turn it over to the good Attorney General Joycelyn Benson, that objective person who goes after every Republican she can and lets all this stuff from the Democrats slide. I can't tell you how many times I put in requests for her to investigate Democrat fraud. No, there's nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing here. Or you can go to the partisan prosecutor in Wayne County or Detroit or Genesee County or Flint, turn it over to them. None of these highly partisan prosecutors are ever going to take up an allegation from Democrats or from Republicans of fraud. So that's just one component. They are like quadrupling the cost to do a recount per precinct. They said that if you interfere with the process, you could be charged with a felony. And they open up who can be charged, and completely, there's no definition. If you ask a question, ma'am, can I ask about this? You just interfered with the process. If you're standing in front of someone and they're bringing a box, you just interfered with the process. That's a felony. So, I mean, this is what they do. It's just like in the old Soviet Union. They write laws loosey-goosey, open-ended. So like Beria, the chief torturer of the KGB would say, you bring me the man, I'll show you the crime. That's what the
Yeah.
Democrats like writing bills. open-ended so that anyone can be charged for a crime, felonies for almost anything. And that all of that stuff is in that bill. So they're wanting to push it through illegally because the bill isn't effective till next year. They want to push it through all illegally this year by approving it through JCAR and waiving the normal weight requirements so that it's all effective this year. Now, it get overturned in the courts. There's no doubt this is as illegal as it comes, but they don't care. Benson's been overturned 8 times in the
Yeah.
courts, but she always gets through the election and then gets overturned.
Right. That's what happened in 2020. We know that one of those examples was that exact, signature verification process. She told the clerks and whatnot to just kind of ignore it, just assume these are all valid signatures, and if there's something incredibly obvious, then we'll take a look at it. That was against, I believe, it was unconstitutional, and that's what the Supreme Court of Michigan overturned. But again, it was too late, right? It already happened. This law, okay, so right now as it stands. This would be maybe a law that takes effect in 2025, as you just, succinctly, I think, explained to us. But I know that right now, you got the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, and she's put this out publicly. Also, the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, have come out and said to the canvassers who are supposed to certify the results of the election, said, if you do not certify the results of the election, we're going to come after you. That was a threat. It was intimidating, and it was the implication there is that you're going to go to jail because, as you just described, that would be considered interfering with an election process. To me, I'm thinking, okay, well, these are canvassers. If they see some disparities or things are not adding up, and there's maybe some obvious instances of fraud here, is it not their job to not certify the election, or is the certification process purely ministerial, as they like to say? Like they just have to do it no matter what they think.
Well, I would say there's an unclear provision under your duty. I forget the exact term. What they want to go after you is duty. Um, so, there's some vague language that's associated with this, but it's not directly in there that they want to go after you. But the process, as it's spelled out in the law, is if the local board of canvassers does not certify, all of that information, everything is turned over to the state board of canvassers. That's the process. Not that you're thrown in jail, but that there's, I didn't see any provision that you get thrown in jail like she's threatening if you don't certify. But that if they don't certify the election, everything goes up to the state board of canvassers where they have to do a verification. Then it comes back to the board of canvassers, and then they do have an obligation to certify at that point. That's my
After it goes
reading
to
of
the
it.
state. After it goes to the state, then
After the
comes back
state
to
board of
them.
canvassers. Yep, and they make a
Okay.
decision. Yep, then it comes
But it's
back.
but what I heard and saw Jocelyn Benson explain were to these individual canvassers in these various counties, saying, if you don't do it, we're coming after you. Now, she didn't say, I'm going to put you in jail. But the implication or the threat, again, it's a vague kind of language there. Coming after you, what does exactly that mean? It's the same thing as like Dan Goldman, the Democratic lawmaker in Washington D.C., said Donald Trump must be eliminated. Okay, well, what does that mean? Somebody might take that
Yeah.
as let's take him out, and sure enough, it's been tried twice now against Donald Trump. So these vague kind of language type of threats, they are intimidating. So let me ask you this: so Senate Bill 603. It prohibits a recount based on the allegations that fraud had occurred. Like they can't consider that. So, what avenues would remain for a candidate who suspects that he or she lost this race because of fraud? Is there any other avenue to
Oh
investigate that
yeah.
prior to the election?
Oh yeah. The good Democrat majority over there said if there's allegations or evidence of fraud, you can. They are very specific, and they put this in the bill. You can turn it over to Dana Nessel or the
Uh,
highly partisan
mm,
prosecutors. And they're
mm,
they're acting like this is some big concession. The media said, "Oh,
yes.
the Democrats have fixed it all." They said you can turn over these part. Now you could always do that anyway. It's like what a joke. You could turn
Yeah.
anyone can turn any evidence over to a prosecutor. It's like this was a big concession on the part of the Democrats to say that you could turn it over. I mean, what a joke. That's your option.
Well, there so you talked about the partisan nature of both the Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, and then there's a partisan nature of the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. Jocelyn Benson made a pledge that she would not be partisan, that she wouldn't get behind any candidates for office, and yet she was just out the other day campaigning for Kamala Harris. The other day she was did an interview with a Democratic lawyer and the Trump Russia collusion hoaxer Mark Elias. He was one of the guys behind that whole concocted false evidence to claim that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin worked together to overthrow the 2016 election, to steal that election. So Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, goes on a program with Elias, this leftist group. Democracy Docket was the name. This is on August 30th. And just weeks, by the way, after she was threatening the counties that hesitate to certify those election results, as we just touched on, that Jocelyn Benson reiterated that point to this guy that we are going to go after anybody who does not certify the election as in the way that we see fit, regardless of the fact that these laws have not taken effect yet. So, as it stands right now, Senator, is it illegal for, let's say, the Wayne County canvassers, which they did back in I think it was the midterms? Two of the canvassers didn't want to certify it because they saw a lot of discrepancies that looked pretty fraudulent. And they didn't want to do it. Is it illegal to not certify the election as it stands right now in Michigan law, um, in the state, or can they do that?
The what's in the law is that if they do not certify on the local level, that all the data, all the information, allegations, everything gets sent to the state board of canvassers. What they're relying on is a provision that could be interpreted as a duty to certify that is, to my knowledge, not been tested whether that could be brought against a local board of canvassers in that situation. Because what they're supposed to do, if they say there's an issue, see, you got to make a difference between a recount and just certifying the election. So in certifying the elections, what we're talking about, because there, if they don't certify, it gets sent up to the state, and
Right.
then it's uncertain whether they can make a charge on that local people done on the normal certification. On a recount, which is what they've eviscerated all the laws on, currently they have full ability right now and through the election to do a full investigation, subpoena power. They can investigate who voted, every single detail. That's what they want to get rid of everything. So in a recount, all they can do is just say, okay, we're putting some numbers in front of you, these two numbers matching. That's it. That's what the Democrats want to do to eliminate any ability. So there's the regular certifying of the vote, and then you get recount. There's two different processes. So you have very clear rights today, which they're planning on getting rid of illegally in JCAR, wiping those all out illegally. That's one thing they're attempting to do. The other one is the process. If the board of canvassers do not certify, that is all sent up to state board of canvassers. They want to also prosecute those people, and that's the part that I've talked to lawyers. They still can't get any clarity. I don't know that anyone's been prosecuted on that, and it's not clearly spelled out in law what would happen in
Well,
that
but
case.
again, if the laws are vague enough, they can find a way to prosecute. They've done that now
Oh
on the
yeah.
federal level with people they don't like on the conservative side of the aisle, and they definitely, I think, Dan Onessa would gladly join Jocelyn Benson. And frankly, she continues to make these threats that they're going to come after these canvassers who don't certify the election results, and that's concerning. It's not. Does obviously the Secretary of State does not have the authority to put into effect laws that don't yet exist. And I know that's what she wants to do. And that's kind of what she was doing back, not kind of, was what she was doing back in 2020 and again in the midterms in 2022. And of course, those got reversed, as we touched on, by the Supreme Court because she's not allowed to do that. She's not the legislative body. She's a Secretary of State who pledged to be nonpartisan, yet she's become very partisan in this effort to make it easier for Democrats to win these elections. Do you find that her efforts to, I'll just throw this out there, her efforts to keep I think the independent candidate Cornel West off the ballot in Michigan, she lost that. She kicked him off the ballot. Of course, the courts overturned that, and then her efforts to keep RFK Jr. on the ballot when he wants to be. He's essentially dropped out of the race. What do you think of those decisions that she's been making as Secretary of State?
Very, very consistent. Everything that she does, that I remember being frustrated when I was a poll watcher, poll challenger going back 30 years, and we would go to Flint, Detroit, Pontiac, where the bulk of the problems, that's where they were. I don't care what anyone says. Well, how could you say that's where they were? Because that's where they were. And that's
Where they
I would
were.
go in to areas, Republican areas, and waste my time because they were not issues. I go into the city of Detroit. I saw so many violations you could shake a stick at. We'd write all of these. We document all of those. We turn them over to. This was all over the state. We're having all of these poll watcher challengers turning in all this documentation, and the Secretary of State threw it in the garbage. And every single case, like, what the hell happened? We got attorneys that are helping us with this stuff. Well, we don't like the optics. We want to be considered a nonpartisan. This is what I heard all the time. Then we get Benson, who doesn't have a shred of nonpartisan operation. Everything is she does is the most partisan, probably, Secretary of State in the nation. And this is just another example. Will it help Biden to keep Cornel West on? Then we're going to off. Then we're going to keep to fight him off. Does it help to keep Bobby Kennedy Jr. on? Then we're going to fight to keep him on. Nothing is about what the law is. This woman has been overturned and overturned and overturned, probably more than any other Secretary of State I've ever heard of. And
Mhm.
she doesn't care. And if they push through these rules in JCAR, she'll get overturned again. She doesn't care. It's
Yeah.
all about cheating in the election. When you're doing what she's doing consistently over and over, it's not by a mistake.
No. And I blame the media again because if they were on her like they should be, these things would not continue. But she knows she gets away with it. And she will not go on programs that counter her narrative any longer. So a lot of reporters, a lot of producers, they'll acquiesce to those demands. So they'll keep having access to people like Jocelyn Benson and whoever else wants to come on the program, and they won't if you say something to challenge what she says. So one of the things she's saying out loud now, very publicly, is that the real threat is not the fact that there's any type of ability to cheat in these elections. She's actually strengthening the laws around the elections to make it very protective. But she's helping people who have been oppressed by conservatives, allowing them to vote. That's one of her arguments. But the other thing is that somehow, and she's making this message, and she's joining other secretaries of state in other states like Arizona around the country to combat what they call a systemic crisis in this country about conservatives going after these poll workers. And they are threatening their lives. They're intimidating them to such a degree that there's multiple bombs threats everywhere, and their lives are being put at risk just by simply volunteering their time to help the election process. Is that really happening? Because when I looked in the state of Michigan, where she claimed this was happening, there were bomb threats, and there were bombs being placed in these precincts or whatever. That was not the case. Those were completely fabricated, made up facts that never occurred in the state of Michigan. How much of a problem do you think it really is that she has to send out the alarm bells saying that these poll challengers are threatening these poll workers to such a degree that we now have got to clamp down on those people challenging who might challenge the results of the election?
uh, we're working off anecdotal evidence, and whenever you're doing that, especially with the Democrats, your red flags better go up. About 2 years ago, I got contacted. I think all of the legislators in Michigan got contacted about, are you being threatened? And I actually called the person back, and they did a phone interview. And I was telling them, yeah, I've had two pretty severe threats against me. That the police had to be called. They had to go talk to these individuals because they were unhinged individuals. So I was telling them about that, and I'm sure other Republicans were as well. And then they produced an article that I'll have to go back and look at who the where the article is, but the entire article was talk about the death threats to public officials. Now I know what I just told them. I
Hmm.
read the entire article. Every single person listed, interviewed for the article was a Democrat.
Hmm.
The implication was
Mm,
Only a Democrat would ever be threatened by a mega Republican. I mean, I
right.
just gave them the details. That's all it's in the police records. Not, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one. I've talked to colleagues that have many death threats, but they didn't care if you're a Republican. It wasn't part of the story. So
Yeah.
I don't trust anything that these people do. And one of the worst one I ever heard of in my life was Monica Palmer, who was at
Yep.
Wayne County Board of Canvassers. When she didn't certify, her and her colleague got hundreds and hundreds of very severe death threats, including being doxxed by someone where her daughter goes to school and the address. A woman sent brutal, bloody, murdered, tortured pictures of a girl similar age to her daughter and said, "This will happen to you. This, if you don't certify your daughter, this is going to happen." I never heard of more severe. This isn't like some vague person calling me up and, well, they knew who I was or where I was, but it was nothing like that. It was me. It was my kid. You do my kid. You got to, it's a different situation, especially if they know where your kid's going to school, all that stuff. To send that, I don't know what I'd have done. I don't know if somebody did that, sent what I would have done. But I felt so bad for this woman. What happened is it was turned over to the police, to the FBI. Almost 4.5 years later, they finally got around to prosecuting this woman, and I still can't find out, was it 5 or 30 days that she got sentenced to? 5 or 30 days.
She was convicted of this, but it took him quite a long time, and I don't remember the duration either, to even bring her to lock her up. This was such a severe threat. I've seen that photo of that mutilated body of a young girl who was killed, and I've talked to people closely associated with it, and it was very severe. The media largely ignored that threat, and it was real. It was vile, but again, it was like covered up and that was probably, you're right. I think the most severe threat that I've ever heard of any type of canvasser, but hundreds of them. And you're right. She and her colleague, who has now since passed away, they could not go home for I forget how long, but I think it was weeks because of all the death threats they were getting. People showing up at their houses, and they couldn't go home because they were so concerned about their safety. But you're right. That does happen. There are threats like that, but it's mainly like if you don't do what the Democrats want you to do, there are severe consequences. Not that it doesn't happen on the other side, but to the point that Jocelyn Benson is coming out here saying, now we need to prevent poll challengers from coming in and observing what we're doing or asking certain questions. We might think those questions are intimidating to us, so we now have the authority to shut them down. That's what she's advocating for, and I wonder how that's going to turn out in this next consequential presidential election.
Well, unfortunately, she was overturned on those poll watcher provisions, but the highly partisan Michigan Supreme Court,
Yeah,
4-3, made many of these provisions that are illegal under the law permissible if the Queen wants to do it. If she's the Queen of America of the Michigan elections, can do whatever she wants to do because she's like the authority that has power that is not given to her under the Constitution or under statute. So it's just very discouraging that we have a Supreme Court that doesn't look at the law of the language and say, no, you do not have the authority to make up illegal rules for elections. And that's just what happened.
yeah. Well, we hope that this does not get implemented. We hope that they're listening to you. I know you've been opposed to, Senate Bill 603 in the first place, and especially it being implemented prior to 2025, which the Democrats want to do, and Jocelyn Benson wants to do, of course, prior to this upcoming presidential election. And based on our previous actions, that may in fact happen, and then it'll be overturned, but it'll be too late because the election would have already occurred. We'll be following this along with you, and I so appreciate your time. You've taken a lot of it with us. So, Senator Jim Runestad out of Michigan, thank you once again, and safe travel. Safe travels back to the great state of Michigan when you leave the border area there of McAllen, Texas.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, and likewise, thank you for being continually courageous in a pretty combative legislative body you're seeing in Lansing, Michigan. All right, that was Senator Jim Runestad. Nice interview. We got into the weeds a bit there, but it's just some of the sampling of what's happening in various states across the country when it comes to election integrity and unilateral decisions by certain government officials who don't have that type of authority legally to do so. So, happens in Michigan, happens probably in California, happens around the country as well. Listen, I mentioned I wanted to read some of the comments that we had this inaugural week of Tom Jordan Live, and there's a lot of people commenting. I'll get to some of them, but I want to thank you for chiming in. And I think it's important that, listen, I read them all. And so does our staff, and it's important, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. I appreciate the encouragement, but we also appreciate the feedback and some of the advice we've been given. I'm going to start off with a guy named Gregory Baltev. He said this: get the person that you have the grievance with on your show and make sure there's no misinterpretation. Greg. I know we've talked before about these types of things, and the reality is I have spent a career talking with the ones who conservatives have a grievance with time and time and time again. We're not ignoring them, and I don't think there's a whole lot of misinterpretation either. The issue has become, I think, somewhat of a crisis, and I'll just let you know that, like back in 2020, when I finally made the decision to get out of the journalism industry altogether because we were not giving both sides a fair shake. I interviewed as many Democrats as I possibly could, and I interviewed as many Republicans as I possibly could as well. But the media at large was doing an incredibly unfair job, and I truly believe it's why I left. I mean, this is a major life decision that I had to kind of contend with, but I couldn't work. To me, it was wrong to continue to work in that industry because of the things I observed. So it's not that we're not trying to give them a fair shake. It's that when they come on our program, some of these people that I have a grievance with now, they didn't like the pushback. And in large part, a lot of the media was being blacklisted. And even as recently as this latest Democratic National Convention, it went up as high as the White House, that they were saying to the station that I just previously worked at, that we're not going to have, we tried to get this, surrogates on for Kamala Harris and all those people. They wouldn't come on our station because certain conservative hosts like myself were being blacklisted because we weren't Democrat friendly enough. So that whole idea that we're not trying to go after or have Democrats on our program. Now, some will come on and great, but part of my effort here is to give a proper understanding of who conservatives really are, what they really believe, and how they really feel about what is, I think, objectively a Democratic onslaught that his tentacles, the Democratic far-left liberal tentacles have reached deep within the media and with the government and in the corporate world as well. So those people are more and more being silenced. And we want to be a platform to give them more of a voice. And yes, we'll have Democrats on, but frankly, a lot of them don't want to speak to me any longer because they don't like some of my questions. So that's what's happening in this current election cycle as well. So Greg, always appreciate your comments. Ken McMullen, he writes this: doing a great job per usual, Tom. Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. Regarding the previous comments, because we get some negative comments in here, he says this. Well, he quotes Zig Ziglar: don't be distracted by criticism. Remember, the only taste of success some people have is when they take a bite out of you. Zig Ziglar. He was great. There's a lot of noise out there, and it's, I think, important to kind of decipher what's noise and what's something that we should listen to. So if somebody has a critique of me, I don't necessarily just thrust them aside. I try to listen to it and say, okay, maybe I could have done that better. Maybe I could have been a little bit more fair on that particular interview as well. Jordan Genso, he is a Democrat. I believe he had ran for office at one point as well. And I was discussing the mischaracterization of Republicans, and I said on one of the programs this week that the Democrats often claim that Republicans the Republican Party is the party that supports like racism and slavery and those kinds of things, which is completely untrue. And he says this: I'm not familiar with anyone saying it's the Republicans who supported slavery in the 19th century, but I think the public identifies it was the conservatives of that era who were fighting to keep slavery. The Republicans were the liberals of that era. I completely disagree with that. The Republicans came in. Republican Party is in large part the same party of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was one of the founders of the Republican Party in order to get rid of the racism that existed, by the way, which most of the country supported. The conservative values of that day were the anti-slavery values, the conservative, the ones that wanted to be beholden to the Constitution. But there were like 5 states out of the 13 colonies, 5 of them supported slavery. That was not the conservative viewpoint. The conservative viewpoint was that this is wrong. Each person is created equal in the image of God. That is the conservative perspective then. It's the conservative perspective now. What has changed is what is now defined as racism. And that's why we've seen the Democratic Party, in my view, is more beholden to racism, but it's taken a different form and shape than what they supported back in the early 20th century with the Ku Klux Klan. That's the Democrats, by the way, and slavery, and not beholden to civil rights. That was a Republican ideal, which still holds true today. This is another grave mischaracterization of the Republican Party. The racism of today now disguises itself as, CRT, critical race theory, inclusivity, all these different things, ESG mandates. What those things absolutely do is they identify people based on their race. And based on their race, they either give them certain privileges or take away certain privileges from them. It's the exact opposite of what they say it's doing. And that is in large part supported by Democratic politicians of today. Critical theory believes, whether it's critical race theory or critical gender theory or some other form of it, they believe in a general class system. So if you're this particular color and you're completely oppressed, but if you're that color, you are the oppressor, and there's nothing either one of those groups can do about it. It is baked into you. That is racism. And that is critical race theory. So that's my position on it. Republicans haven't changed. Democrats really haven't changed that much either. Richard B., 1953, says, interesting highlights of the candidates in the Michigan Senate race. Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Richard B., 1953. That was our interview with Mike Rogers, Senate candidate, he a Republican as well. We also have P. Dan01. Tom, are you going to podcast these shows across podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple? Yes, absolutely. All of the shows are available on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, all your podcast platforms, YouTube. So this live stream ends up living on all major podcast platforms after we go off the air here, after we're finished with our live streaming, which we are finished right now. We're over 10:02 right now here on the East Coast. I want to thank you for listening. Join us at Patreon as well, Tom Jordan Live, YouTube, all the major platforms. And by the way, if you're in the Michigan, kind of the Metro Detroit area, I'd love to see you Sunday. I'm pastoring Calvary Chapel, Waterford, Michigan. Got a service at 10 a.m. You can find out more at ccwaterford.com. Love to see you there. Until next time on Monday, God bless you. Have a great weekend.